The topic today is growth and development. Leading up to 2 weeks of discussion we'll have in the next two classes about the knowledge economy and its future. And in today's class, I want to divide my argument into three parts. First, to describe the new dilemma about development that is beginning to emerge in the world. Second, to place the discussion of this dilemma in the context of ideas about growth and growth miracles. And finally, if there is time, in the third part of the class, to give the example of a particular national experience. The dilemma of development as it begins to appear in the world today. Let me begin to describe it by portraying the message of classical development economics, the economics of the second half of the 20th century about the problem of development. Now, there's no clear distinction between the theory of economic growth, which has developed as an internal part of the mainstream of modern economic theory, and the theory of development. There's no fundamental difference between the problem of growth as it manifests itself for relatively poor and relatively richer countries. Development economics, nevertheless, emerged as a special field on the outskirts of the main body of economic theory, and it considered a wider range of topics and used a wider range of methods. In doing this, however, the development economists of the late 20th century pursued a strategy of peaceful coexistence with the main body of economic theory. And in retrospect, it seems that this strategy was disastrous for the future of economic theory. Development theory had in it the elements of a challenge to the main apparatus, to the central paradigm of economics, but it never really exploited this larger intellectual significance. And then, of course, what happened is what always happens. The empire struck back, and development economics then was reduced to an entirely marginal situation which it occupies today. Today you'll find that rather than suggesting alternative models, alternative paradigms of economics and economic growth, it's occupied with low-level empiricism and practical problems, which on their face don't seem to be economic at all. Like, for example, the use of mosquito nets to diminish contamination by malaria in poor countries. Well, this is another story. So the message of late 20th century development economics, reduced to its essentials, presented in its simplest form, is that there is a shortcut to rapid economic growth. The shortcut to rapid economic growth can be summarized in a simple term: conventional industry, industrialization. The shortcut, according to this formula, is to shift resources and workers from the relatively less productive to the relatively more productive sectors of the economy, meaning in practice to shift them from agriculture to industry. The industry that the development economists had in mind was what we now know as Fordist mass production industry. I'm calling it, for short, conventional industry. The large-scale production of goods and services by relatively rigid machines and production processes, staffed by semi-skilled labor in very hierarchical and very specialized work relations, the technical division of labor. And this form of production was seen as promising an accelerated route to economic growth for the following reasons. First, it dealt with tradables, that is, the goods that it produced could be traded on the world market and result in hard currency earnings for the exporting countries, which in turn would allow them to import not just consumer goods, but also capital goods. Second, there was this form of industry, of industrial practice, and the machines that it took assumed a very stereotypical form, was a short list of types of machines. For example, the classic metal cutting lathes of conventional industry, and of work practices. And in addition to being stereotypical, it had a third advantage, which it was readily portable. It was as if it were a kit that you could put on an airplane and take from one country to another. And then, miraculously, you would have this shortcut to economic growth. Now, the development economists acknowledged that the use of this shortcut ultimately would come up against the constraints imposed by what they described as the fundamentals. And the fundamentals were of two kinds: institutions and education. But actually, what was required from the fundamentals, both by way of institutions and by way of education, was very modest. Institutionally, there had to be a mixed economy, a regulated mixed economy, and a state that had a place for planners or for development economists, for people like them. And they paid significant lip service to education, the other fundamental. But the reality is that the education required of a worker in a conventional industrial factory was almost nothing. What was demanded of the workers for this mass production industry was first rudimentary numerical and verbal literacy, sufficient to understand instructions about, for example, the operation of the machines that they were using. Second, discipline, a willingness to take orders and to shut up. And third, elementary manual dexterity, especially hand-eye coordination. That was it. And so the requirements, both institutional and educational, were very modest, heightening the attractions, the appeal of this shortcut. The shortcut was then institutionalized in many parts of the world in the form of a particular development strategy, often labeled import substituting industrialization. A developing country established industry with these characteristics that I've just described, and used this form of industrial production to replace industrial imports from the already industrialized economies. Now, what has happened is that this which used to be the most advanced practice of production, conventional industry, has ceased to be the most advanced practice. There is another most advanced practice, which we're going to label the knowledge economy or the innovation economy or the experimentalist economy, dense in knowledge and in technology, based on science, and above all, devoted to permanent productive experimentation. And this new vanguard has emerged in all of the major economies of the world, not just in industry, advanced manufacture, but as I mentioned in the first class, in every sector of the economy. So it is multi-sectoral. It is not unisectoral. But in every sector of the economy, it has emerged as a socially exclusive fringe that excludes the vast majority of workers and of firms. So it is both multi-sectoral and insular. It is an insular vanguardism, a knowledge economy for the few. And with the emergence of this new advanced practice of production, the previous advanced practice, conventional industry, has survived only as a vestige dependent on very limited returns to labor, or as a satellite of the new vanguard, because the people in charge of the new vanguard have discovered a way to bifurcate, to divide the process of production into two parts. The non-formulaic, original, creative, and most lucrative part they keep for themselves. And the routinized or commoditized part they delegate to firms and workers in other parts of the world, acting under what seems to be the formula of conventional industry, but it's this version of conventional industry that acts as a satellite or partner of the new vanguard. So under this system, one country after another in the world has deindustrialized. Industrialization is collapsing. Conventional industrialization in many countries around the world. It's the old vanguard, the vestige or the sidekick to the new vanguard. And the new vanguard partnered with this subordinate form of the old vanguard is characteristically able to outcompete what the old vanguard produced, producing the same or better things more cheaply, more efficiently than the old vanguard did. Now then, there emerges a dilemma in the world. The dilemma is this. The shortcut offered by the development economists to rapid economic growth has stopped working. But the alternative to it, the attractive alternative to it, which would be a broad-based, socially inclusive form of the knowledge economy, doesn't exist. It doesn't really exist anywhere in the world. Not even in the most advanced economies with the most educated populations. How then could one expect it to exist in developing countries? So this is the dilemma. The old path has stopped working, it's blocked. It no longer produces the result that was expected of it. But the alternative exists only in this insular form, which produces vast inequalities and also seems to result in a slowdown in economic growth itself. Now, why a slowdown? A slowdown because if the most advanced practice of production is denied to the vast majority of the labor force and of the firms, of the businesses, how not to expect that the result will be economic deacceleration. So that's the dilemma. That's the new dilemma of development, which little by little is beginning to be recognized in the world as the central problem. For all economies, richer and poorer. Now, this is not a true dilemma in the following sense. It's not a true dilemma because one side of the dilemma is not for real. That is, there's no way to solve this dilemma on the first side by somehow making conventional industry come back. It won't come back. All you can hope to do is to buy a few more years for it through subsidies, through protectionism, through constraints on outsourcing, and so forth. And that is the path which has in practice been followed by many left and right-leaning governments around the world. But it's a path without a prospect. The only way in which this dilemma could be solved, if it can be solved, is on the second side. That is, by finding a way to turn the seemingly inaccessible alternative of creating an inclusive knowledge economy into an accessible one. By, for example, breaking it up into pieces or into stages so that it would be possible to achieve it. Well, let me stop there because with those first remarks, and then ask for your comments, questions. Yes, you back there.
Can you elaborate a little bit on why you're saying that industrialization has failed? I'm wondering, I guess I see that in advanced economies that they're deindustrializing now.
That there'd be?
They're deindustrializing to some
Yes.
extent. But like last semester I was in an African economic development class. The professor seemed to think that the answer to Africa's economic development is industrialization and that it's working where it's being implemented. So I'm just wondering your thoughts on that.
Well, we have to be careful about the term. So what is ceasing to work is conventional industrialization, what I described as Fordist mass production. The other advanced knowledge-based experimental industrialization is working, but it's working only in its islands because it has this insular character that I described. And where it survives, conventional industry typically survives either because the country is poor and can profit from a very low wage to continue producing goods and services by the old methods, or because the conventional industry is in fact teaming up with the advanced knowledge-based form of production in the way in which I described. So that's what I'm claiming to be the phenomenon that is occurring. Yes.
Can you say a bit more about the knowledge economy vanguard not being shared? Because I'm thinking through the knowledge economy is applicable everywhere. It's not sectoral. It applies to all.
In principle, yes.
It applies to all virtually everything.
Yes.
Why are the companies that have this, that are operating at the vanguard, not buying up everything and applying this everywhere and investing overseas?
Well, that's a profound question. So if there is a more productive form of industry, why doesn't it become the whole economy? Why is it just a part of the economy? And if we understood the answer to that question, then we would have made already a big advance in understanding what it would take to disseminate the knowledge economy. Because now it's quarantined. Now there's the following issue, which is the knowledge economy that we see or that we have, this insular knowledge economy, quarantined, cabined in these fringes, is in many ways a truncated or perverted form of the knowledge economy. Because a practice of production reveals its potential only as it spreads. And it then has to be reinvented in many particular circumstances. So, for example, one of the characteristics that typically accompany this insular form of the knowledge economy is that it results in the generalization to a large part of the labor force of precarious, unstable employment. So there's part which has all the profit and all the fun, the creative and lucrative part, and then the workers, everyone else, to exaggerate, is condemned to some kind of make work. And somehow then the state has to come in afterwards and compensate all the losers. The losers under this system are the majority. So if it's so wonderful, why doesn't it become universal? It's not easy to answer that question, because the answer to that question turns out to have to do with all of the institutional and educational impediments, not just to the dissemination of the knowledge economy, but to its deepening. Because the dissemination of it and the deepening of it are two sides of the same process. Yes?
Do you see the new involvement of companies in higher education as an attempt to spread the knowledge economy?
In higher education?
So these new forms of post-secondary education, whether they're credentialing or boot camps or these various things, is that an attempt you see at firms to try to solve this problem of spreading the knowledge economy?
It's results, I think, from a very partial, incomplete view of what the problem is. So, in the popular mind, the knowledge economy, especially in the United States, is associated with the platform oligopolies, Silicon Valley. And so the elite of Silicon Valley looks around and says, why is the rest of the country not like us? Why isn't there a knowledge economy in North Dakota? And a simple answer to that question is they don't have our capabilities. They're not as skilled as we are. They don't know what we know. Therefore, we should educate them. And of course, they have an interest in this education because in order to sell its products and services, the insular knowledge economy depends on a certain elevation of capabilities on the part of the general population, enough to be consumers although not creators of the knowledge economy. But if it turns out that the deepening and dissemination of the knowledge economy depends, for example, on innovations in the property regime, then we're talking about something very different, which then becomes very uncomfortable or subversive for the elite of the knowledge economy. So I would say that the answer that they typically give is an answer that is somewhere in between naivete and self-interest. Like as in this idea that let's educate them so they'll be more like us.
Do you see that as their attempt to solve the problem, though? I suppose their attempt to correct.
When you're
this
asking about their
imbalance.
motivations, I mean, I don't know. Yes.
So what would be the possibility to make them creators instead of consumers?
What would say that again?
How could they make them creators, not just consumers?
Well, that's the project of society. That's not a project of a bunch of entrepreneurs, right? So, and that's what we have to discuss in the subsequent discussion of the knowledge economy. But so the way this appears in the economic discussion is here's this vast technological revolution, right? And Robert Solow, who is the most influential growth theorist, not development theorist, growth theorist in the main body of economics of the late 20th century, famously quipped, the computer revolution is everywhere except in the productivity statistics. So there's been this technological revolution. Why doesn't it appear as a qualitative transformation of the economy? In fact, if you look at the same societies in which the knowledge economy has most advanced, like the rich North Atlantic societies and their outposts around the world, the productivity has significantly slowed down. And there's what you could describe as stagnation. There was a brief period at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, between, say, 1995 and 2005, when there was a spike in productivity. And that has been attributed retrospectively to the economic effects of a one-time absorption of these advanced communication and information technologies by what were basically very standard firms, like, for example, Walmart, to manage complex information. So the knowledge economy, really seen at a deeper level, involves a new set of practices. It's not just a bunch of gadgets. It's a new way of doing things. We're going to explore it more deeply next week. And it can't be reduced to the deployment of a small set of technologies. So it hasn't produced this result. Now then, there's a discourse, I think I also referred to it in the first class, in the United States, that goes under the label of secular stagnation, a label of, that comes from the 1930s, actually, from Alvin Hansen, at the time of the Great Depression. And this discourse wants to attribute the slowdown to what are supposedly the less revolutionary characteristics of the contemporary technological innovations when compared to the technological innovations of 100 years ago. But to me, this makes no sense. What could be more revolutionary in principle than artificial intelligence? So we have a promise, but the promise is not kept. And the knowledge economy remains cabined. And in this cabin quarantine form, the abyss between the advanced and the backward sectors of production becomes deeper and deeper. So deep that the traditional policies of compensatory redistribution by redistributive social spending and progressive taxation are unable to deal with it. Because the retrospective compensatory redistribution would have to be massive, and long before it reached the requisite dimension, it would begin to disturb the arrangements and incentives of the productive economy, and as it were, to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. So this is a problem both with regard to economic stagnation and with regard to economic inequality. Yes?
You mentioned toward the end of your remarks that a way of making the knowledge economy more inclusive would be to break it up into stages. Could you say that?
Well, not really. I can't now because that's the program of the next 2 weeks. But I was simply trying to characterize the dilemma, and I was saying it's not a real dilemma, because the first side, which is the side of bringing back mass production, isn't for real. You can't bring back, for example, the Rust Belt industries in the United States in their conventional form will not come back no matter what you do. All you can do is to prop them up for a little while. Huh? So if there is a solution to this dilemma, then it's on the second side, not on the first side. And that's why it's not a real dilemma, because I think it can be solved to the extent that it can be solved, but only on the second side. But that would then require a set of innovations, educational, institutional, cultural. What they are is the object of our future discussion. Yes?
Yeah, I'm wondering if what you're proposing in terms of the sort of conventional industrialization not being a tenable solution. The Rust Belt example you gave, that's in the context of a developed country like the United States.
Yes.
I'm wondering if that can be universally applied to developing countries, and secondly, whether the conventional industrialization is a necessary prerequisite to a knowledge-based.
Yes. Well, those are two different questions, right? So if there's time, if there's an opportunity, I give an example in the final part of the class of Brazil. That is a developing country. And we in Brazil did have, in the 20th century, a major conventional industrial park in the southeast of the country, in Sao Paulo. This was one of the great industrial apparatuses in the world. And it's now falling apart. And so you can ask there, could we bring it back? Can we bring it back? And I think the answer to that question is no, we can't in this new circumstance. Huh? Now, maybe I should add just one element of my account of the dilemma. In the period in which conventional industry was regarded as the most advanced practice of production, there was also a view of the major division of labor in the world, the way in which the world economy was conceived. And it was the centerpiece of traditional trade theory. So world trade was viewed as being organized around trade between capital-intensive and labor-intensive countries. So the developing countries were poor in capital but rich in labor, and they traded to everyone's advantage, supposedly, with the countries that were rich in capital but poor in labor. That was the basis of trade. Now it seems that in this age of the emerging insular knowledge economy, we have a different world division of labor emerging, in which the network of advanced parts of production spread throughout the world is in command. And it's not a simple trade between labor-rich and capital-rich countries. But each of the countries is divided internally, all the major economies of the world. So, yes?
Yeah, so my question revolves just like how we measure productivity or production in our economy. So my thought is like maybe 100 years ago you have a factory, it's relatively simple, it produces X amount of goods. But nowadays you have like all this middle management, you have all these accountants, all these lawyers, all these consultants, you know, pencil pushers, etc. Your company now employs all these people. Technically you are employing people, you're giving them good jobs, but they don't like actually produce anything physically for your company. They just kind of tick all these boxes and get paid. And then additionally, you have complex financial instruments where companies may not actually be producing that much, but then through like leveraging your debt or bundling things into complex financial
Absolutely.
instruments, you then
Yeah.
create these other assets essentially. Does that act like, how do you factor that into increasing productivity in the economy? Does that count, or is that just like more?
Well, in principle, the service, so you have labor productivity, which is the core concept of productivity, and then total factor productivity. In practice, they converge to a very large extent. So these professional services are in principle taken into account in measuring productivity. But the fact is that the aggregate growth rate has slowed down. So it's not just that productivity has slowed down, it's that the result that everyone sees and feels and lives, which is growth, has slowed down. And which in turn intensifies the conflict over distributive shares in society. So this is a problem for everyone, because if there isn't growth, accelerated growth, everything becomes more difficult, including redistribution. Yes?
So you described some of the historical chain of events where this developing economy was thought as a shortcut to regular capitalist economy or capitalist achievements. But is the knowledge economy a way back, a way forward to achieving what the shortcut tried to do, or is it going back and trying to achieve something new? And if not, couldn't the solution be not trying to get a shortcut to the end goal of a good capitalist economy, but maybe trying to do something else?
Well, we were discussing it in this context from the rather narrow perspective of its contribution to productivity. But obviously, the conception of the most advanced practice of production is a richer conception, right? So I recur to an idea mentioned before. Why did Karl Marx and Adam Smith believe that the best way to study the workings of the economy was to study the most advanced practice in their time? In their time, it was mechanized manufacture, and then which then became industrial mass production. And that's what's studied in Smith and Marx. It's the object of the inquiry. They believed that it was the best way to study the workings and prospects of the economy because it is the one that most fully reveals our powers. It's in the most, so, and now in retrospect, in the light of the emergence of the knowledge economy, we could say, what makes the most advanced practice of production most advanced? It's not necessarily when it emerges the most efficient practice, the one which produces the most output with the least inputs. It is the practice of production with the greatest fecundity. It has an exemplary role to reach the frontier of productivity, to remain there, and to inspire the transformation of the rest of the economy. And from the standpoint of the emergence of the knowledge economy, even in its insular form, it can appear to us that what makes the most advanced practice of production most advanced is that it's the most mindful practice. It's the one that is closest to the human mind and that most directly embodies the powers of the imagination. That's what makes it most practice. So it's not like just a dumb tool. It's us. It's our powers of imagination materialized. That's the sense in which, so, and that leads to answer to what was implicit in your comment or question just now, that it's not as if it were trying to do just the same thing that conventional industry did. It is raising the prospect that it could allow us, as I said in the first class, to become not just free from the economy, but free in the economy, because this would be a different kind of work. If we could deepen it and disseminate it and rescue it from the perverse forms that it takes in its contemporary insular manifestation. Now let me then go on. Yes?
I have a question on how do you ensure that even if the knowledge economy is widely distributed, that these alternative forms are valued in the system? So like you said, there are people that say, we know best, we have the best knowledge, and we're going to distribute that. So the goal is to get over that and have it widely distributed. How do you ensure that those forms are valued and are tried?
Which forms?
Alternative forms of knowledge, I guess.
Well, that's a struggle. I mean, so we're coming from a period in history in which the main object of the progressives, of the reformers of society, was the humanization of the market order. And they abandoned the attempt to reshape the world of production. But this is an anomaly, and it's a losing position in politics. So here there's a suggestion that the shape of the world of production is not something that can be abandoned. That is, the progressives would have to have a progressive approach to the supply side of the economy. They would have to have a productivist project, not just a redistributivist project. And that's what's involved. And then it becomes a struggle over what the content of this new production system will be. So there goes, the implicit in that is a different idea of the ambition of the progressives. It's not simply to humanize the economic order, it's to reinvent it. And not simply to put a humanized form on the proposals of their conservative adversaries. Now, I want to broaden this discussion of the dilemma of development into a wider conversation about growth and growth miracles. And the starting point is the observation that rapid economic growth is an anomaly, a huge anomaly in history. So why did it happen and what's involved in it? So from the 18th century on, a small corner of the world, the North Atlantic world, Western Europe, began this revolutionary transformation. And we can discuss what's the basis of it. So it seems that a significant part of the historical background was a set of accidental, surprising events following on the disintegration of the Roman Empire in the West that foreclosed what generally happened in history. What generally happened in the major protagonists of world history, which were the great agrarian bureaucratic empires of antiquity, is that there's an imperial government, and the imperial apparatus had to deal on one side with the grandees, who were always attempting to extend their control of the land and of the peasants. And then on the other side, there was the mass of smallholders, who were the ultimate source of both taxes and soldiers. And the interest of the imperial center was to prevent the landholding grandees from dispossessing the peasantry, the smallholders, and thereby destroying the fiscal and military basis of the imperial center. But this was always a very difficult operation, because if the emperor and his government put themselves at the front of the smallholders, he risked riding a tiger that he couldn't hope to control, the tiger of revolutionary despotism. So we have in these great imperial bureaucratic empires recurrent cycles of economic and political breakdown in which the grandees end up dispossessing the smallholders, then the market economy breaks down, the empire falls into fragments, and so forth. In the West, somehow this process was prevented or foreclosed. And a degree of political division and social and cultural pluralism persisted, which at some point became irreversible. And that pluralism, that openness between states and cities, among countries, among sovereignties, among cultural forces, was the essential enabling condition of this Western ascent. Then part of the world begins this exponential rise in productivity, this economic revolution, measured superficially by this concept of productivity growth. It has been said often that 9/10 of economic growth is growth in productivity. But productivity is just a black box. What's in it? We have to open the black box. And when we open the black box, what do we see? Well, first there's technological innovation. Then there's organizational innovation, institutional innovation, and conceptual innovation. Technology is nothing all by itself. It has to exist in a context. And one way to think of technology is to think of it as a kind of materialization of the channel between our experiments in the transformation or mobilization of nature, of the forces of nature, and our experiments with the forms of cooperation, That's what technology is. Now, what is the essential logic of this growth in productivity? What is the axis around it, or the direction around which it's organized? Productivity depends on cooperation. We have to organize cooperative regimes. And it also depends on innovation, as I just described. Technological, organizational, institutional, and conceptual. Cooperation and innovation depend on each other, but they also interfere with each other, because every innovation threatens to disturb the established cooperative regime. What then is the direction of this growth? It is the form of cooperation, the cooperative regime, that is most hospitable to innovation. Now, let me give you a simple example from contemporary societies. The individual has to be protected and made capable, but all around him there has to be innovation. So, is he going to be protected by ways that rigidify the surrounding social and economic space? Or is he going to be protected in ways that leave the surrounding space open to experiment and innovation? So, for example, we give him certain rights or endowments. Will these rights and endowments be universal and portable and distinct from the position of any particular job? That would be a simple way in which we could combine the flexibility in the surrounding arrangements with the endowment or equipment of the individual. The individual must be made secure and capable in his haven, so that all around him there can rage a storm of innovation. That's just a simple formula by which to describe the spirit or the essential direction of these revolutions, which I'm going to call growth miracles. Now let me introduce another conception, the conception of the path of least resistance. So whenever there is an innovation in the world, the tendency is for that innovation to be instituted in the form that least disturbs the dominant interests and the established preconceptions. And that diminished or domesticated form of the innovation is what I'm calling the path of least resistance. Now, the path of least resistance diminishes or constrains the potential of the innovations, because the potential of the innovations characteristically depends always on the empowerment of a larger group of people. Let me give you a simple example. And the example comes not from economic life, but from military life, because it's often easier to use military metaphors to describe productive problems. So, at the end of the 18th century in Europe, there was the invention of a new form of artillery pieces, much more powerful than the existing firearms. And the exploitation of the operational capabilities of these artillery pieces required that they be deployed flexibly in the field together with infantry. But the armies of the autocratic, aristocratic states of Europe were armies of peasant conscripts who fought unwillingly. So they had to walk in compact formations with people behind them holding bayonets to knife them if they attempted to run away. The armies of revolutionary France were armies of citizens. And they didn't have to walk in compact formations or to have these people with bayonets standing behind them. So their plasticity made it possible to exploit the operational capabilities of the artillery pieces. And that's what we characteristically find in these in the evolution of the technologies of production. So what is a growth miracle? A growth miracle happens when there's a conflict within the elites of a society, and part of the elites decides, we're going to take our country out of this backwardness in which it threatens to be dominated or conquered. We're going to make it rich and powerful. And in order to do that, in their struggle with other parts of the elite, they have to appeal to some larger constituency in society. So this happened, to go back to the first class. This was what happened in the United States in the first half of the 19th century. Hamilton's project interacting with what I described as the selective democratization of agriculture and of finance, a world of smallholders and artisans. It happened, for example, in Japan in the mid-19th century, the Meiji Restoration. They seized power in order to make Japan stronger and richer and preserve its independence vis-a-vis the Western threat. And then it happened in the Northeast Asian tiger economies, and then in China. So every time there is this attempt by part of the elite to take power in the state and use the state as the instrument to create an alternative to the path of least resistance and to exploit the potential of the new forms of innovation borrowed or imitated from other parts of the world. Now, in the contemporary world, the world in which this dilemma that I presented to you arises, what is the nature of this broader constituency? So there's a mass of workers, of poor workers. In most countries of the world, they are disorganized. And what is their horizon of aspiration? It's not proletarian. It's not like the proletariat that Karl Marx described. Their horizon of aspiration is petty bourgeois. Their characteristic horizon of aspiration is the small business class. And by default, the object of ambition is archaic, isolated family business. Not because that's the natural or necessary way of satisfying the aspiration to modest prosperity and independence, but because that's the most visible way. That's the one that's presented most readily. So an elite has to take power. It has to have a productivist project as part of its program of national strengthening. And it has to appeal to this mass of poorer people, mostly inorganic, disorganized, objectively poor, but subjectively petty bourgeois. This is the typical situation in the world. It's not the only situation, but it's the most common situation. So, for example, you'd have to imagine a way in which the retrograde small and medium-sized firms the backward part of the economy, could be brought closer to the technological frontier. And now there are a large number of independent economic agents who have no fixed connection to any business organization at all. For example, machine repair people or nurse practitioners. And they would have to be lifted up also and transformed into what you could call technologically equipped artisans. So there's the empowerment or equipment of this mass of unequipped and disorganized people, producing over a larger space of social inclusion a form of empowerment. And that would result in a growth miracle. Now, the instrument that is doing this is the elite in power, part of the elite. And so they have to use the state. And the state, of course, is a conundrum. Because in the actual divided class societies that exist in the world, the state can always be used and is regularly used as an instrument to extract advantages or rents for some groups to the detriment of others. Now, a shortcut to try and avoid this porousness and servile character of the state is to have a vanguardist dictatorship that acts in the national interest, supposedly. But this is a costly and dangerous shortcut because this vanguard will be vulnerable to mistakes, to superstitions, it will be dogmatic, and of course, it will be interested in the preservation of its own power. You could have the idea that there's a perpetual motion machine like the American Constitution, in which you settle on the definitive form of a free polity and you establish it once and for all. But there is no perpetual motion machine. And so the state is a conundrum without a solution. So you can't not use it, you have to use it. But none of these alternatives that I've just described are optimal. Now, furthermore, once there's this idea of a growth miracle, the state has to exist in a world of states, other states. And that raises then the question of globalization. So, in what kind of world system is there the best chance for these growth miracles to succeed? The fundamental requirement is that the elite that has taken power to bring about one of these growth miracles have the space to experiment with the institutional arrangements of production of the state itself, that did not have its hands tied. Now here we find something very interesting about the form of globalization that has in fact prevailed in the world in recent decades. It is a form characterized by what you could describe as institutional maximalism. So under the World Treaty Organization treaties, or what now much more important, the regional pacts like the Transatlantic Partnership, the Trans-Pacific Partnership that are being negotiated, the tendency is to include in the rules governing world trade the need to adhere to a very particular form of the knowledge economy, of the market economy. Not just the market economy in general, but a very definite form of it. For example, to outlaw under the label subsidies all the forms of strategic partnership between governments and firms that the countries that are now rich used in order to become rich, but that they want to deny to their successors, the latecomers. So that's what I'm calling institutional maximalism. It's to build into the rules of the world system the commitment to a definite form of economic organization. By contrast to institutional minimalism. Now, institutional minimalism is to say, we'll trade with one another, but to the greatest extent possible, we will leave open the forms of internal organization, including internal organization of the market. Now, institutional minimalism is possible. We know that for a fact, because the regime that preceded the regime of the WTO, which was the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, was characterized by institutional minimalism. The maximum openness with the minimum of restraint on the power to experiment with the institutional arrangements of the economy. And that's what we would want. You could say that was prefigured in the economic evolution of Europe by the development of commercial law. The law merchant, the premise of the law merchant is that there would be an international law of trade, but it would be compatible with wide disparity in institutional and legal differences within the trading countries. Now, often people say that they can't experiment in this way or that way because globalization won't allow it. So some forms of globalization are better than others for these growth miracles. But even within the existing regime of globalization, we also know that there are wide disparities in the extent to which countries are able to engage the world economy in a way that preserves their own independence, their room for maneuver. So, for example, take the contrast between the way in which the Northeast Asian and Chinese economies on one side and the Latin American economies on the other dealt with the same form of globalization. So, the Latin American economies, on the whole, signed on the dotted line. They followed the instructions of the academic, economic, and political authorities of the North. So the idea was they would prevent populist, nationalist autarky. They would prevent governments from embarking on irresponsible adventurism. And the way to do that was to have a low level of domestic saving, to depend on foreign saving, on foreign capital, to keep the capital account open, and to allow the internal production system to be penetrated by foreign capital. So foreign multinationals occupying the intermediate parts of production in Latin America, producing, for example, the consumer durable goods that were produced in other parts of the world, but imitated or then reproduced their conventional forms in Latin America. By contrast to what the Northeast Asian economies did. They minimized their dependence on direct foreign investment at the start of the process. They depended on loan capital. They closed the capital account, and they had a very high level of domestic saving. So they created a basis within the existing form of globalization for a high degree of national autonomy. So what we've seen is that Latin America has been the part of the world which has suffered the most disastrous decline in its relative place in the world economy. And the lesson to be derived from this contrast, which I just summarized, is that in history, rebellion is not always rewarded, but obedience is invariably punished. Now, let me stop there again after this discussion of growth miracles and ask for your comments. And then I'm going to go on to the third part. Yes?
I'd like to ask if you could elaborate more a bit what was done in this area of Asia, because at the beginning they required also capital from the outside to our, I guess, internal processes. So just wanted to see what was done in comparison to what was not done in Latin America. What was done to actually spend less on the foreign capital?
So I'm claiming, so here is something subtle, which is very important. So let's go back to the earlier discussion of the dilemma of development. So one simple understanding of development is that the crucial constraint on economic growth is the surplus over current consumption. This was, for example, the idea that Marx had. So the functional justification for the existence of class society, according to Karl Marx, is there's a form of coercive extraction of a surplus. And the surplus was the basic constraint on economic growth. Now, I want to argue that only in the most primitive conditions of economic accumulation has the size of the surplus ever been the basic constraint on economic growth. So we know, for example, that the aggregate saving rate in these ancient agrarian bureaucratic empires, which I mentioned, was on the whole higher, much higher, than the aggregate saving rate, for example, in Britain on the eve of the Industrial Revolution. So the size of the saving rate was not the constraint. The fundamental constraint was the nature and the rate of innovation, as I just described, that dynamic of organizing cooperation and innovation and the form of cooperation most hospitable to innovation. Nevertheless, when a country is trying to organize a rebellion, a rebellious strategy of economic growth, which is one of these growth miracles, as I described it, a way of deviating from the orthodox recommendations and a forced acceleration in growth, it has to be able to say no to the domestic and international capital markets. It needs a buffer. And the buffer will be in hard currency reserves, and the buffer will be in domestic saving. Now, then there arises this complication, because what has happened in a large part of the world is that when the leftists lost faith in Marxism and in the state, they became Keynesians, vulgar Keynesianism. And Keynesianism teaches that the savings rate is much more a consequence than it is a cause of economic growth. But this idea fails to take account of the strategic requirements at the beginning of a process of rebellious development, one of these growth miracles, where you need to have a war chest so that you can say no. So I would say there is a reason for fiscal severity or fiscal realism for the sake of rebellion. And on the surface, this idea can mimic the orthodox idea. So the orthodox idea is you need to have the war chest, you need to have a fiscal surplus in order to gain the confidence of the financial markets. And the confidence of the in financial markets will in turn provide investment. Now, this idea makes no sense. It's not happened in any country in the world. The country in the world which for the last 30 years receives most foreign direct investment is China, which has defied all of the pieties of economics. So the religion, the obedience of the formula counts only at the beginning. In the medium to the long term, the only thing that counts is results. So they go to China because China is where the action is, independently of the willingness of the Chinese to kneel at the altar of financial rectitude. But you nevertheless, at the beginning of the growth miracle, need to have this war chest. Not in order to win financial confidence, but paradoxically for the opposite reason. So that the country and its government not be on their knees before the capital markets. That's what I would say. But this is all by way of elaborating this idea of the essential nature of the growth miracles. Yes?
Does this policy prescription work for small, insignificant, unattractive countries with less clout? I'm thinking here of New Zealand. I can't imagine New Zealand, dictating its own terms of trade, not needing to play by the rules of the system.
I think you would have to discuss every circumstance in depth, in detail. But it seems to me that I would still want to argue my general thesis that rebellion doesn't always pay, but obedience is always a disaster. So it's still going to be necessary to then find in the particular economy, given its circumstances, what is the formula for the empowerment of a larger group of economic agents that allows this. So I don't know what it is. We have to study the particular case. But it would be, in that case, some combination of the use of the natural resources with something about knowledge in the cities.
But it's not just a recipe for big powerful companies like China.
It's not.
This isn't just a recipe for big powerful countries.
No, absolutely not. I think in its general character, it seems to me absolutely universal. It's this. So we have in contemporary history this very small list of these growth miracles. And the question is how you add to them. Now, this is not somehow a purely entrepreneurial or economic process. This is the claim I made about taking power. So an indispensable element of this idea is that some group of people animated to change the character of the national economy has to be able to take power. And to take power, they have to be able to convince a larger part of the country, a larger constituency, which in most of the world, I argued, is this subjectively petty bourgeois but objectively worker constituency, which is not organized and which aspires to this condition of uplift. And by default then has this dream of having a small plot of land, a little store, a business, because that's the default for all the other options that are not presented to satisfy this aspiration. Well, let me then go to my country example, and my country example is the example of my own country, so Brazil. So, now I'll say first, make a preliminary remark. So, you know, Brazil is one of the most unequal countries in the history of the world. But I don't think that its major problem is inequality. I think that the major problem is mediocrity, and that the only way of overcoming inequality is in a wave of is in the course of an attempt to overcome mediocrity. And I'll explain a little further. So, Brazil is the country in the world that is most like the United States. You have two countries of almost identical size, one in the north, one in the south, both established on the same basis of African slavery and white settlement. Each of them is among the most religious countries in the world. And in each of them, they're the most unequal of their respective types. The United States is the most unequal of the rich industrial countries. Brazil is the most unequal of the of the continental developing countries. And paradoxically, in the midst of these vast inequalities and exclusions, the mass of ordinary men and women continue to believe that everything is possible. So the most important attribute of these societies is their vitality. This is the mysterious element. And the threat to vitality is mediocrity, is belittlement. So what happens in these great countries is there's this huge energy, this huge human energy, this dynamism, this infinite anarchic dynamism that comes from below, and somehow most of it goes to waste. It goes up in smoke for lack of opportunities and of instruments. Now, in the period from 1870 to 1970, and especially from 1940 to 1970, Brazil was one of the fastest growing economies in the world. And then, after 1970, and especially after 1980, it stopped growing. In the period in which it grew, it established in the heartland, in the economic heartland of the country, in the southeast, an industrial system, which was one of the most developed industrial systems in the world. Was import substituting industrialization, as I described it before. And it developed initially under the Vargas regime and the Vargas dictatorship. And it was one of these growth miracles. They took over the state in the name of an idea of taking Brazil out of backwardness. And they organized their own constituency, the organized industrial labor force headquartered in the capital-intensive part of the economy. At this time, the GDP of Brazil was greater than the GDP of China. Now the GDP of Brazil is a fraction, a small fraction of the GDP of China. There has been a dramatic reversal, a massive deindustrialization. So the growth miracle was not for keeps, and it has in a way been reversed. But the consequences of the reversal have been masked by the fact that Brazil has extraordinary natural resources. So now the most prosperous part of Brazil, of the Brazilian production system, is agriculture, ranching, and mining, which employ a small part of the population, but pay the bills of urban consumption. And The other thing that works in Brazil are the banks. So there's a febrile financial regime, the mainstay or linchpin of which is the management of the public debt. 2/3 of the tax take is devoted to paying the interest rate on the public debt. And 10,000 families are the creditors of the debt of the state. The state owes debt in its own currency to its own citizens. And everyone in Brazil who is an asset holder and fails as a producer can still hope to prosper as a rentier. So those are the two things that work. Now, so this is what's happened to the economy. So it's gone backward to this combination of primary production and financial speculation and rentiers. Meanwhile, there has been a profound transformation in the character of Brazilian society. So about 1/3 of the country now are in a kind of secession, an Americanized secession. So many of them are evangelical Protestants. Some of the forms of religion are autochthonous. Others are imported from the United States. Their main economic basis is agro, not big agribusiness, but medium agro. And they have a culture of self-help and initiative. At the top is a new middle class. It's a middle class that comes from below. It's not oriented anymore to public employment and the liberal professions, but to small-time entrepreneurship. And behind these emergents, as we call them, is a mass of still poor people, objectively poor, who have assimilated this culture of self-help and initiative. And so the country is now divided. We just had an election. So the traditional reformist left-leaning position is represented by the man who was elected, Lula. And the practice is to accept the demands of the financial markets, to seek this blessing of financial confidence and financial rectitude, and then to take part of the surplus generated by agriculture, ranching and mining, and pay off the poor people through these transfer programs. Now, the amount of resources that the Brazilian state devotes to the rich through the payment of the extortionate interest rates on the public debt is a multiple of the amount that they use to finance the transfer programs for the poor. But nevertheless, the system works, or seems to work, because there's a kind of co-option. Everyone is paid off or bought off. That's what passes for the left. And what about the right? So then we have a right-wing politics, which paradoxically does more or less the same thing. That is, it has the same, it put a financier in charge of economic policy, even a more radical version of the submission to the financial markets. And it doubled down on Lula's transfer programs. increasing them even more. So this is the opposite of a growth miracle. So and then the confrontation with the real productive problems of society is replaced by identity politics on the left and culture wars on the right, just like in the United States. And so we have a third of the country which is like a bunch of Americans from the Midwest or from California inside our country, and with this other form of consciousness, and being in fact directed by this right-wing movement, and a humanizing left with no productivist project. So that's the reality. Now, I have to mention one more element in this story. And this element has to do with the intelligentsia. And what I'm going to say next could also be said of much of the world. There are two main wings to the Brazilian intelligentsia. There's a Marxist wing, which is now a minority, and there's the majority of the importing and imitation of American-style social science and policy discourse. So the Marxist wing has taken an axe from the zeitgeist and cut the zeitgeist in half and thrown out the good part of Marxism, which are the transformative aspirations. And it's kept the bad part, which is the historical fatalism. So it's an interpretation of Brazilian reality which makes all of this, which I just described to you, seem natural. And so, and it leads to the idea that a real change, if we were to have a fundamental change, it would have to be a revolutionary change. We'd have to take this system and replace it by a completely different system. And that always seems to be impossible, or if it were possible, it would be too dangerous. So the way that the institutionally conservative social democrat, who used to be a Marxist, thinks is that the only thing that's left to do is to put a human face on this world, which is the world that is left to us. So the idea of revolution, by some strange inversion, has been converted into its opposite. It's been made an alibi for its opposite. It's become a pretext for humanization, the humanization of the untransformed market order. And the other part are then the imitators of American-style social science, which is read as a set of practices that suppress the idea of structural alternatives, like economics. Economics first among them. And now let me conclude this little parable by telling you a story which shows how this collective drama that I've described is translated into the problems of individuals. And becomes an existential crisis as well as a programmatic predicament. So for decades, I've been seeing young Brazilians come and enroll in the economics doctoral program at Harvard and at MIT. And the following situation recurs constantly. So the young person is exceptionally talented, analytical, but has a defective education. And the young person comes here and says, I'm going to write a thesis attacking neoclassical economics and creating some, and contributing to the formation of some alternative. And he goes to speak with his thesis advisors, with the Harvard and MIT professors, and they're totally perplexed. They don't know what he's talking about. And Because after all, there's nothing in their education that would give, unless they're Frenchmen who belong to the French wing of mainstream economics, they don't know what it is. If they're French neoclassical economics, they know all about Marxism, and at least they know what the conversation is. So this young person gets no help from his professors. His professors don't prohibit him from embarking on this endeavor, but they are unable to equip him. So then this individual comes to feel that he can't do what he set out to do. Now this is a deep personal crisis. He's a failure. He thought he was going to be a thinker, an ideologist, a critic, and he's not going to be. So this same person ends up writing a thesis applying the apparatus of established economics to some Brazilian phenomenon, like the study of the Brazilian hyperinflation in the light of monetary theory. So the individual has a sense of failure, total failure. Now, what does he then think? He thinks, well, I'm not going to be what I wanted to be, but at least I'm not going to be poor, because I'm not going to go back to Brazil, and I'm not going to return to the middle class where someone is no one if he's middle class in Brazil. So I'm going to go work in the central bank. You know, in most countries, central bankers are people with brilliant pasts. In our country, they tend to be people with brilliant futures. So they go into the central bank, and they establish their credentials, and then they jump from the central bank to the finance business. And that's how they start to become rich. And this has been an episode repeated again and again, so that this failure, this national failure, is constructed on the ruins of a series of personal existential projects. Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote the terrible epitaph on this moral calamity when he said, they couldn't become men, so they decided to become rich. Well, let me now ask for your questions. Yes?
Can you talk about why you think Brazil went from having, what sounded like a very successful ISI economy to an industrialized economy in the Southeast, as you said, to the state that it is today, where there's other countries in South America who had their own transformations, but Chile, for example, which has been very successful.
Well, I would debate what way Chile has been very successful. Huh? It's a different story, but it's a version, it's a variant of this story that I told about deindustrialization. Brazil deindustrialized. Now, Brazil's advantage, which was also its disadvantage, is that it had this easy way out, which was the primary sector. Now, I have to be careful here, because this isn't a debate condemning agriculture from the standpoint of industry. So it's not just that the primary sector could help finance the transition to a different practice of production. It's that the primary sector could itself become a terrain for the development of an alternative practice of production. There's no reason why agricultural production can't begin to ascend the ladder of added value in knowledge and science. So in our country, a real growth miracle has to take radically different forms in the different regions of the country. The country is the size of Europe. It has different worlds inside of it. So, for example, the center-west, the central part of Brazil, is a radically different world from the Amazon. So 50 years ago, there was no agriculture there because it was judged, the subtropical savanna was viewed as inappropriate for agriculture. Brazilian science, through the public organization Embrapa, through transformation of the soil, created the physical basis for the advance of Brazilian agriculture. So there in the center west, we would have to have a project for the diversification of crops, intensification of ranching, more cattle per acre, and above all, progressive industrialization of agricultural and ranching products. That's a move in the direction of the knowledge economy. Now, what about the Amazon? So, in the Amazon, we talk about sustainable development. But what is the content of sustainable development? So, there's an initial practical problem, which is land tenure. We have a situation in which less than 5% of the of the land in private hands has clear legal title. So there's chaos. No one knows who has what. So long as there's this chaos about land tenure, pillage will always be more attractive than either preservation or production. So we have to fix that. And then we have to give content to the idea of sustainable development. Now, what is sustainable development? So, of two things, one, either it is a form of primitive extraction of natural resources, like native populations taking latex from the trees, without scale, without technology, without science, and therefore without a future, or it is a highly developed form of scientific production, mobilizing the resources of world science to take advantage of the biochemical diversity of the tropical rainforest. That's a totally different story. So it's either a variant of the knowledge economy or it's primitive extraction. There's nothing in between. Now, I'm not sure that the world understands that when it professes to have an interest in the Amazon. So we would have to formulate a productivist project and give it a distinct expression in each major region of the country. So the national project would have to be translated into a series of regional projects. And then we have to reinvent Brazilian federalism to organize a cooperative and experimental federalism as the instrument of this. Now, it happens that the Brazilian state is one of the very few states in the world that has many of the institutional instruments that would be necessary for such a project. It has the public development banks. It has a series of technical schools that were formed in the Vargas period in these quasi-state organizations. It has all of these instruments, but paradoxically, it doesn't have the project. So, and who would the constituency of this project be? It could be some of the national producers, the producerist element in the national elite, as opposed to the rentiers, and this mass, this petty bourgeois mass, with this aspiration of entrepreneurship, of innovation. There would have to be won over to this from their present idea. That would be the project. But this project, of course, is a vast political endeavor. And it's difficult in a situation in which almost everyone has an easier way out through the combination of the use of the surplus of the primary sector with these strategies of co-option that have been the dominant method for gaining and holding power in the country. Yes.
So I've been struggling to understand how this traditional concept of comparative advantage in economics plays in, if it plays in at all, in the new knowledge economy? And if not, what are like the counter arguments against that particular paradigm of comparative advantage?
So the question is whether we think of comparative advantage statically or dynamically. So the vital issue in answering your question is the extent to which comparative advantage can be created. We don't just find it. Now, obviously, to create it, we have to build with the materials at hand. But the idea is, there's this movement, right? And people have to be able to reinterpret their identities and their interests in such a policy of transformation. So in each of the regions of the country, there are elites. There's a local entrepreneurial class. There's a small business class. They're trying to do things. I return to the way in which I began the exposition. The basic problem is a problem of primitivism. And it's not just productive primitivism, it's educational primitivism. So, the nature of education. You know, the culture is an anarchic, syncretistic culture. And what we do in our schools is the opposite. So our school system is devoted to turning 21st century Brazilian children into 19th century French children. So it's the encyclopedia. It's a memorization, and it's like a conspiracy against our natural impulses. So, and education has been a project of national liberation. So, Sarmiento in Argentina, Vasconcelos in Mexico, John Dewey in the United States, these were great projects of national liberation. So we would have to have a productivist project and a project of educational liberation, a struggle over power in the state to take the state for this productivist project, the reinvention of the country. How else can we be useful to humanity unless we exemplify a different way of making this brute human energy fertile by equipping it, by giving it eyes and arms and wings? I think that's the essential spirit. I think that was enough. So we will continue next week.
That's